Hello everyone, my name is Andy Rhodes. I'm the Customer Education Manager here at Kognity, and I am your host for today's podcast, where I'm super excited to be joined by a special guest. Today we have Stacey Roshan with us, published author and Director of Innovation and Educational Technology at Bullis School, whose work has been featured in USA Today, The Washington Post, CNN, and PBS NewsHour, amongst others. Stacey, how are you today?
I'm doing so well. Thank you for having me on.
Of course, my pleasure to have you here today. I've given a little bit of background into who you are, but would you perhaps like to elaborate for our listeners?
Sure. So I actually started as a math teacher. I've actually been at Bullis School my entire educator career. This is my 15th year here at Bullis. And as a teacher, I started looking to technology as a solution for some of the things that I wanted to change in my classroom. And that inspired my journey into educational technology. And as that's grown, my role at school has shifted, and I've been able to connect with so many other people around the world, which brings us to this conversation today.
Awesome, thank you. Yes, it very much does so. And your book is titled Tech with Heart, Leveraging Technology to Empower Student Voice, Ease Anxiety, and Create Compassionate Classrooms. Can you talk to us a bit about that easing anxiety piece?
Yeah, so that was really the Kickstarter for everything for me. I was teaching AP Calculus, and I felt like I wasn't creating that calm, welcoming environment that I had dreamed of in becoming a teacher. There were so many questions, there was so much content to get through, and I am at a school where there's just a lot of pressure here. I mean, there's a lot of pressure in all high schools, especially these days with the, emphasis on getting the best of the best of grades to get into colleges. And it's just so competitive. And I really wanted a way to be able to spend time with each student every day. I also teach at an independent school. We have smaller class sizes. And that was, when I came to the school, I said, that's what I'm going to do every day. And then this AP Calculus class, it was very hard to create that atmosphere that I had envisioned. And so I realized how much time I was spending at the front of the room doing that very teacher-directed lecture portion of class. And I wanted to, find a better way to get in with students while they're working instead of being, at the board for so much of class time. And so I learned about screencasting, and that was it for me. I just learned about screencasting, and I said, I'm going to make video lessons for as much of the material that my students are comfortable with. I ended up flipping my classroom entirely that first year. Before the flipped classroom was a thing, my students were calling it the backwards classroom because they thought it was backwards. They were doing the homework in class. And it just created this really collaborative environment in the classroom. And the biggest piece was that it was easing the anxiety. But then I saw all of these side benefits. Like, it did open up this time and space in the classroom for collaboration, to hear from students, since it wasn't just about the hand raisers anymore. And also, students were becoming so much more resourceful and independent in their work. And that was like this side benefit that I wasn't going in for originally. That was the very best thing I could have ever done, was really creating a more student-centered classroom where I empowered students with the resources they need, and then they could really take ownership for their learning. Of course, there was a lot of coaching that went with this, thinking again about my AP Calculus class and how I set this up, but it was just a huge shift in how my classroom ran.
No, I get you, and it's super interesting to hear that technology wasn't just great for the purpose you intended it to be great for, but also seeing added benefits and bonuses alongside that is super interesting and really validates the inclusion of technology in our lessons. Something you mentioned was about the flipped classroom, or should I say backwards classroom, depending on which of your students' terminology we want to use. Would you mind maybe elaborating a bit on that, in terms of, since you were such an early adopter of that methodology, what really worked great and what was the students' opinions on that?
Yeah, so when I did it in my AP Calculus class, it was, students had struggled so much with their homework in kind of the years prior. just because math homework can be intimidating, going home and doing that. My students, one of their first reactions was that they would spend a lot of time on their math homework before, but they felt like their teacher didn't know how much time they spent because like maybe they wouldn't even be able to finish the problem. And to them, that didn't feel successful, even though us as teachers, we know that it's more about the process than it is about that final answer at all. But sometimes the students were just working and working, trying to get a problem, couldn't get to the end. And they got really stuck at home and they felt stuck alone. And so by bringing that piece into the classroom entirely, it just created this collaborative atmosphere where students really were able to work with one another. And that was another thing that they really told me. They were like, I just hadn't spent this much time doing math with my classmates in years because we had so much time for it now. And so those were some of the initial reactions. Parents were also really happy because students were feeling less anxious about their math homework. They knew how long it would take them. Also, if they had sports practice on a Tuesday, they could kind of load up on 2 videos on Monday so they could pace themselves a little bit better in a way that they couldn't do in other classes. And so they really appreciated that opportunity also. So flipping my AP Calculus class went way better than I ever could have anticipated in that first year. I kept going with the flow. Like I had created a chapter of videos, but then I asked them for feedback. And, I said, at any point, if this isn't working, we can kind of switch back. And they never wanted to. Now, when I flipped my Honors Algebra 2 class, which was 2 years after I initially flipped my AP Calculus class, I just thought my students had done so well with the flipped classroom. I'm going to flip my Honors Algebra 2 class. This again was before the flipped classroom was really a buzz term. So now it would be different. But then when I flipped it, the parents didn't really understand. And because I was teaching 9th and 10th graders, that was probably the biggest mistake that I made anywhere along my flipped classroom journey, was not explaining it well enough to parents when I did it, especially with the 9th and 10th graders, because parents are such a support for their kids when their kids come home and they're, upset, or they're not feeling certain, or they're just anxious about the beginning of the school year. If parents don't understand, they can't properly explain it to their kids, and you can't start that trusting relationship. And so I had to backpedal because in September, I realized that parents were confused. A lot of them just thought that, students had to learn everything on their own. That was the biggest misconception, that students needed to learn everything on their own. And then I helped them in class, but the learning, happened through the video. And that's the biggest misconception I think there is possible. The learning doesn't happen through the video. I mean, the video is background knowledge, but the learning happens when we work together. And so now I'm bringing the most powerful learning into the classroom where we're together, we're supported, we're working collaboratively. And so once I was able to shift that, which took, into October, everything shifted in that Honors Algebra 2 class. It was a fantastic year. But again, I always say that you need to inform parents and really make them understand what your classroom culture is about, what your classroom is about, how it's set up, and just make sure that they're there to support their kids. That's the beginning of the trusting relationship.
Really good point there. And I think it's super interesting to think about the parent role when it comes to integrating not just technology, but new ways of learning in our classrooms as well. And I think things are moving so fast that I think it's important that not just the teacher, not just the student are sort of driving that new initiatives that happen within our classrooms, and including the parents is a really great way to make sure everyone's reading from the same page. I mean, I suppose thinking about the fact that you implemented flipped classroom really early, and yeah, we can say now that it's more common and it's more well known, but if we think about how EdTech as a topic has become even more hot in schools right now, both with the fact that schools had to suddenly make a switch to being fully online, and now schools are coming back into the physical building with loads of new tech that they've been using previously, then wondering how that then fits into what they want to do now that we can see each other face to face again. What sort of shift would you like to see then when we think about how students learn in collaboration with technology as we navigate through?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the most powerful things with tech is the ability to connect and collaborate. And I mean that within the classroom and outside of the walls of the classroom as well, which I think is really important. For me, one of the biggest things is opening up forums for students to communicate. When we talk about collaboration and communication, how can we hear from all the different types of learners in our classroom? I started with saying, like, when I flipped my classroom, it wasn't just like the hand raisers anymore, because I wasn't stuck to the board for such a long period of time. I was able to get around the room. There's also kids that you walk around the room and they're quiet all the time in the classroom. But when you give them a forum to share in a way that's most comfortable for them, they open up in brand new ways. And I think one of the things that has been most eye-opening to me, even though I'm the type of person who, I was that kid. So I was looking out for that type of kid because, again, I wanted to create kind of a classroom that I felt like I didn't quite have. My teachers didn't have any of this technology at their fingertips. And so when I started using Flipgrid, I think that was a very remarkable moment for me, because I started assigning Flipgrids where students would go home. I started with having them just talk to me like camera, like we're talking like a FaceTime, except obviously not synchronous. And asking them to just talk to me about how things are going. Do you feel ready for the quiz or test? What do you feel nervous about? Just some general open-ended questions. It was about our math learning, but it wasn't a math specific thing where they were solving a problem or anything like that. And all of a sudden, some of the kids who really I never had long conversations with yet opened up, and they would max out however much time I had left on that Flipgrid. And it was remarkable to me. And that was the beginning of really building new levels of relationships with my students. And from there, I started creating with the Flipgrids ones where students would talk out their math solutions. And so again, I got to see how students were thinking. Some of the students who weren't, kind of raising their hand, talking it out in class, so I didn't really get inside their head yet. I opened up the Flipgrid, and then they made these long responses again. And I want to say that it's shocking. It's not shocking, but it is shocking when you see it, every year. I'm like, wow, I'm so glad I did this. I never would have known the student in this capacity or in this way. And there's been so many instances of this. It's not a one-time thing, happens time and time again. And so I think it's really important, again, that we provide these multiple platforms so that we can hear from all different types of learners in a way that is most comfortable to them.
Awesome. And it's really interesting as well to think of how your experience of being a student yourself really was mirrored in how you saw students in your class, but then on top of that, you got to see a way that helped those students in a way that you didn't feel that yourself. And I think that's not just a powerful way that technology is useful, but it's also really powerful for you as a teacher to be able to see the help that's now on offer that wasn't available to you when you were in a similar situation. And when I think about my experience of using technology, I'm aware from working as a teacher in schools and working with schools that there's really clear opportunities from an academic perspective with things like instant feedback, real-time curation. They're thinking from the human perspective, which I know is central to the thoughts in your book. How do you view technology's role in the way you work with your students?
Yeah, there's so much that we can unpack in that. So, you mentioned the real-time feedback, a really important human aspect, actually. I think we think a lot of times of technology as something that's a little bit automated and, students can get instant feedback. And yes, that's great. But when I say that I feel like it really brings in this human element, it's because, first of all, I can, in real time, see how students are thinking through problems. We've kind of talked about that before, but there's huge value in this process over just the final product. Like when a student turns in a paper at the end in a math classroom, I see the work that they've done, but I don't see how they were thinking through that problem. Like in my classroom, I have students actually writing out problems. They have these little Wacom tablets, that you plug into your computer, so they actually have a pen. And I can see all students writing on their little mini whiteboards. I use Pear Deck and can see the student who's getting stuck at the beginning. I can see the student who gets started right away, but who's getting stuck in the algebraic manipulation. In a dashboard view, I get all this information about what needs like students have, what I need to get around to, where they might be struggling in the process, and not just like, did they get the final answer? Did they not? And that's really, really powerful. And again, that snapshot view in an instant. And then through my flipped classroom, they're watching the videos at home before they walk into the classroom. I'm able to see how they watch that video. When I say how they watch that video, because, I leave these little questions along the way. I use Edpuzzle. And so they answer the questions. There's the ones that are auto-graded, which is great information for me and for the student. As they're watching, when they get something wrong, they can rewind the video because they know, like, I thought I was understanding, but I tried to answer that question, got it wrong. Maybe I should rewind. Again, that's something I coach them through so that they get better at that. But all that information I get before students even walk into the classroom. So instead of me going in with like just this agenda of the curriculum, I go in knowing what the class needs are. I go in knowing what individual student needs are, and all that information drives what I do. So it's really about student needs that day. And then the last thing that I'll just talk on is just that element of, we're been talking a lot about social emotional learning. Sometimes, it's like hard, I think, to implement in some classrooms. To me, the technology has made it rather simple. It's so easy for me. Again, like if I'm doing a Pear Deck, for example, instead of just starting with like question 1, I'm always going to start with a little check-in, like, how are you doing? And it's just a safe space for students to share with me whatever's on their mind. And I really like to take it outside of just math, like just a general check-in. How are you doing? How are you feeling? Was there something great happening in your week you want to tell me about? Something really hard in your week that you want to tell me about? Students don't always open up every day, which is natural. Teach teenagers after all, but I'm giving them that opportunity if they want to share. And so many do share, and they get more comfortable sharing because I follow up with them. And so they know that I'm invested in that. And I think that's a really important piece too, when we're asking questions, to make sure that we give feedback, we follow up, we are listening, that they feel seen and heard. But it's simple ways to integrate these things. It's not like rocket science. It's not these crazy things. It's just that we now have these platforms that allow us to do, that real-time instant check-ins, but also kind of that more private thing that we're talking about. When we're using Flipgrid, we can also set it to video moderation so that things remain private between just me and the student, and just opens up another forum for that conversation to happen.
Yeah, and I think that following up whenever asking that sort of question really is so vital. And it's like currency in the bank. Like, the more you ask and the more you follow up, the more trust it builds up. And I think students really respond well to that, knowing that the adult in the room is someone who's able to listen to them and also sort of care for them and not just educate them on the topic at hand. So yeah, really awesome points there. Thank you, Stacey. And that actually leads us really nicely into another topic I'm interested in, and that is classroom participation. Where do you think we are collectively within education on this topic? Are we in a good place, or are there some changes to make to our classrooms to make it more inclusive for all?
So this has got to be like one of my favorite topics to talk about. Again, I'm going to really weave in my personal experiences here, because I was very much, as I said, that introverted student, a perfectionist, to a degree that was not healthy. And raising my hand in class was always something I really struggled with. It wasn't that I didn't want to participate. I just didn't always know how to participate. I also was never the quickest student. So I was never going to be the first one to raise my hand, even if I wanted to say something. I'm a processor. I need time to think. Even these days, I love when somebody gives me an agenda going into a meeting. I like to know kind of just what to expect. I can start thinking about it. I like it even better when that person asks us, or gives us a space to leave feedback before we walk into the meeting. Because again, I might not be the person to raise my hand in the meeting. Doesn't mean I don't have something to contribute. I don't have something to say. And so I think that technology shifts the game here, like in a really, really big and powerful way. So again, let's go with the pear deck. If I create that pear deck for students, now I'm asking everybody to share what's on their mind. I can project those answers in the classroom anonymously. So students, again, can build that level of safety. I want students to know that it's okay to have an incorrect answer, but they're not going to know that at the very beginning of the year. And so we can build that level of trust, and I can project the wrong answers without a name attached, and I can showcase that, and we can talk about the wrong answer, and we can talk about why we learned so much by talking about the wrong answer. But I don't have a student standing up there at the front of the board, right, with like themselves attached to that wrong answer. And I think it really helps me build that classroom climate early on in the year. And again, just this idea of seeing what everybody's saying in the class, seeing the multiple ways of thinking through a problem. If I just call on one student, I hear one way of thinking. I can call on, 3 different students and we can talk about 3 different answers, but now I can showcase all the responses. So in talking about like how we celebrate all the different voices in the classroom, how we celebrate the multiple ways of thinking through problems, how we really help students understand, especially in a math class where so often students think that there's a right way to do math, there's a wrong way to do math, and it's that black and white. That's not how it is. And again, like, how do I emphasize to students that it's more about how you're thinking through the problem than that final answer? I really can do that when, again, I can shine the spotlight on all the different ways of thinking. And, sometimes I'm even putting up the wrong answer and I'm saying like, this was a great wrong answer. What does a great wrong answer mean? And us talking through like the thought process behind this was really wonderful. Yes, we got to the wrong place in the end, but look at how, like innovative this was, or look at how creative a solution this was. And let's talk about the wrong turn, but let's also talk about and celebrate what was great about this. And so I think to me, it's just like, again, thinking through why sometimes I felt like I wasn't measuring up in the classroom. To me, a lot of times it was because I wasn't the first to raise my hand. And it felt like the first person was like always being praised. They had the best participation score, and they were getting things right, and they were getting, that praise for it. And I wasn't always that kid. Or I would get, a report from the teacher, like, home that Stacy's doing so well in class, but I wish she would participate more, or, I wish she would answer more questions. Again, like, it wasn't that I didn't want to, I didn't feel like I had the correct forum for myself to be able to do that. And so it did take a toll on me. I felt like I wasn't measuring up. I think that's the best way of saying it. And I want my students to have other ways to be able to contribute, so that they feel like they are doing that. Brings me back again to the Flipgrid, in that we do a lot of Flipgrid for math too. I was talking about more general check-ins, but I do have Flipgrids where students actually solve their math work. And there are times when they do it more privately, but there's also these public ones where they answer a question and choose what question. Early on in the year, I assign them so that I can differentiate, but then they get to choose what answer they want to put up there. And then students learn from one another. So instead of like me going over questions for test review, students are doing that. And then they're able to showcase what they know for the whole class. And I see students become like really like mini little video makers here. They're just like so excited to be teaching their classmates. And you can definitely see the influence of them watching like YouTube tutorials and probably even TikToks these days in terms of like their creation process, and them being excited about sharing their knowledge with their classmates in a way so many times that never would happen kind of in the classroom. And they're able, again, to reach more students. I'm able to have collaborations with not just one block, but like all my different blocks. I'm able to have collaborations outside of my classroom walls. We can do it with other students, especially in an AP classroom where everybody's learning, like that is, there's good things about AP, there's bad things about AP. One thing that's really cool is that I can talk to other classes and we're all doing the same material. We're all prepping for the same test. And we have the same curriculum that we're going through. So, there's just really awesome ways for when we talk about collaboration, it can reach far and wide with the power of technology.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think it's really thought-provoking for me. And I know we're talking an awful lot about technology here, so you could say it's a future-facing conversation, but you really made me think backwards a little bit there, where you're not alone in the fact that your visual and obvious participation was something that students have traditionally always been assessed on over content, you could say, over quality of answers. It's how willing are you to take part in the teacher's eyes. Willing is not the correct word for how it actually is for the student, but that is a common thread through how things have been before technology opened up that door for us and gave us alternative means to participate, because you could say that participation in the class, despite it being totally unnatural to some students, has taken prominence. And I think it's really interesting to hear of the ways that you've broken that down and brought it into a new realm. So yeah, I really loved hearing that answer for you. So let's lead into the topic of EdTech tools that give a voice to learners, all learners in our classrooms.
Yeah. And I think, again, like, how can we empower every voice? I'm going to just take it back to touch on one thing that you were saying right before then, in empowering all learners. One of the things is that, like, when we talk about leadership, when we talk about the student leader in our class, how often is that leader that we're talking about the student who's pretty vocal, who's pretty loud? We see that in leadership positions when they're running for different leadership offices around schools, right? But what I've been able to see, especially through like these flip grids that I've told you about, is the student who becomes that classroom leader can be that quietest student. Like, actually the quietest student can now be the one who's leading the way, who's really tutoring all of his or her classmates. They have this opportunity now to, and I think a piece of it, a big piece of it, is the comfort piece. So when students record this flip grid, they can record in the comfort of their home. They could record wherever they feel most comfortable. They can kind of script something in advance. They can record, they can watch their recording, they can re-record as needed. They have all this opportunity to kind of put out what they want to put out in a way that, like, again, feels best for them. And I think, that's really another element of empowering every student voice, that leadership. What does leadership really mean? And how can we shift that thought of what leadership means? I mean, like, we're talking all about education, but I want to see that this impact happen way outside of just the classroom, in every type of meeting that we're on. I think that we've seen a shift too with like all this pandemic stuff, which has been awful in most ways, but in one way that I think has been cool is that companies use, Zoom or Google Meet to have conversations, and people are able to chime in on chat. There's a lot more work that happens up front before the meeting that can be more collaborative and can be more inclusive of all voices. So it's not just that loudest voice who's drowning everything else out. I think it becomes even more apparent on a Zoom call about that drowning out of voices that happens all the time in real meetings and face-to-face meetings. When we're on a Zoom call, though, like, it physically, like, it knocks the other person out. Like, one person's voice can be heard and the other person's voice gets totally muted out. And I think that's just like amplifying what was happening in our face-to-face meetings already, but maybe not everybody was aware that that was happening. I often felt like that.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think Zoom and online meetings have changed the landscape in that regard. And thinking of leadership in general, I think there are steps happening now that different types of leaders are starting to get more prominence than they have traditionally. And I think that can only be a good thing. And I think starting that as early as possible in the classroom is obviously beneficial for everyone.
Yeah.
I'd like to kind of jump back and think about how it was for me when I worked as a technology integration specialist. And during that time, like, I think sometimes I felt like it was flying in the face of the role in the eyes of my colleagues, because if one of my colleagues would come to me with the tool that they would be interested in using in their class, quite often I would answer with, but why? And I think that seemed strange to them sometimes, because it was my role to integrate technology in the class. But I like to come at it from the point of view that just because a technology tool is shiny and new, it doesn't necessarily improve learning in your class. And I think in that regard, I'd really be interested to hear that. What does meaningful technology integration mean for you?
That was so well said, and I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, so many times my meeting with other teachers starts with like, I had sent something about Flipgrid. Somebody comes in and they're like, oh, I'm doing this project. I really want to use Flipgrid for it. That looks perfect. And if I just start by answering their question, which is usually like, how do I set up, the Flipgrid for this particular project? I would lose out. I really would, because half of the time this person comes in wanting to learn about a specific tool, and then we take a step back, like, what's your project? What are your goals for this project? And we wind up at a different tool than that person had initially come for. And I think that's the really important piece, is like thinking about what your learning goal is first, and really thinking about the learning first, thinking about the problem first. I flipped my classroom for a reason. That reason was to really ease the anxiety in my classroom. That was like what I was looking towards at all time. And it was the driver for what tools I've chosen along the way. That piece of creating the video was just the first element to creating this classroom environment where I could hear from every student in the classroom. I could address some of the problems I saw myself growing up, or like that I felt in the classroom myself. But it was through thinking through that problem first, instead of like this shiny new tool, that I was able to kind of like uncover the power of the tools. Because I think that the power of the tool is when we think creatively about it, right? So like when Flipgrid was first created, I'm sure they weren't thinking about it being used for students to like solve their math problems. It's, a video discussion platform where students can talk, reply to one another, threaded discussion platform. When I saw it at first, I was like, okay, it's going to be for like, a video camera. We're talking to one another. And then I said, okay, well, now this app has been created. Why not use the app, the other camera on your phone, and hovered over a piece of paper? Let's talk simple technology, right? But what did I want from that? I wanted to hear how students were solving problems. It was as simple as that. I wanted to hear them talk it out in a way that like I could hear from every single student in my classroom. When you can't hear how every single student in a typical classroom is solving a problem, it's impossible to go around to every student while they're working. And now I could. And so again, I just think that we really uncover the abilities when we start with the question, we start with the problem, we start with that. And also we get to better solutions. We lead to less overwhelm for ourselves and for our students. Like, start small. I flipped my classroom. It took me years and years and years to flip my classroom. In my book, I actually have an 8-year process of my flipped classroom journey, because that was when I published my book, from the time that I had started. And each year I did something new and I added something new, but every year I had like one really strong goal and I focused on that. And I think that's also a big piece behind why like the remote learning with the pandemic learning was so difficult, because like it was whoosh, a flood of, we need to do all this stuff now instead of being able to really do that backwards design, which we normally do as teachers, and we think with more intentionality. There wasn't the time for that. So, now classrooms have been flooded with tools. The good thing about that, though, is that the hard work of like learning some of the technical aspects have been done. So I hope that now we can really take a step back and pare down our toolkit and think again, what's the problem we're trying to solve? And then keep the tools that are working towards those goals. And even some tools that were cool, maybe let go of them because they aren't serving the needs that we have and our most important priorities.
Really great. I couldn't have put it better. Starting with the problem and then seeing which tools work best to solve it is just golden information, and a great tip for everyone listening. So on the topic of the tools that you use, can you maybe give some background into which ones are your ultimate favorites right now and the reason behind using them?
Yeah. So I probably named most of my favorites already. So for video, for students watching videos, I use Edpuzzle to embed questions. That's the real driver behind needing that tool. I think Edpuzzle is a simple tool for students and for teachers, get great analytics. I wouldn't assign videos without that interactivity anymore. In the classroom, I love using Pear Deck for warm-ups. Again, like to me, that is like, I couldn't run my classroom without a tool like that anymore, for the ability to hear from every student about how they're thinking through the problem, being able to anonymously project those answers on the board. I get away from having hand raising be the only way that you can contribute. I can ask every student. I mean, every student's actively required to participate in every single question that I ask, and we can celebrate all the different responses in the room. Again, remembering that I should start with a question that's asking the student how they're doing, that check-in, have a closing activity where students can reflect and they can let me know anything that's on their mind. They can get it off their head onto the screen in real time, so they don't need to remember to come after school or anything like that. And again, just making that space for students to share, I think, is a huge priority. Then Flipgrid for that video response, just hearing the student's voice in a different way. Again, I love the private ones where I can just chat out things with students. They're just talking to me in a safe way. And then also hearing them think through their math work is really powerful. A tool that I haven't talked about is Kami. I really love Kami for students turning in work. It's like you could think of it as like a PDF annotator that's collaborative, but it's so much more powerful than that because there's audio in there, there's video in there. I can create a video recording if a student turns in their work through that, like just a PDF of their handwritten work. I can not just annotate it with pen, but also I can leave voice feedback. So I can really leave that tone. I think that's so important, not just marking up a student's work in red, but leaving that, like voice feedback again. And also I can leave recorded video feedback right on their paper, which I think is hugely powerful. I can also reuse comments, which really makes grading more efficient. And then there's all different tools for like student video creation. I love WeVideo for students to creatively demonstrate their knowledge. And I'll leave it at those 5 tools because that's enough. There's so many other things that I think are so cool, but those are like some of my essentials.
Awesome. Thank you, Stacey. And we are quickly approaching the end of our chat today. There have been some really great nuggets of information in there, and I'm going to stick to that magic number of 5 that you just mentioned, and I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here and ask if you could condense the topics of conversation we've gone through today into 5 key learnings for our listeners, and to super briefly sum up for us, what would those be? Yeah,
so I think the first one is providing forums for all students to share their ideas in a way that's most comfortable for them. I think I'm going to say empowering every voice in the classroom. I think it's overlapping with that other one, but I just want to emphasize that point because I think it's one of the most important things that we talked about. Creating a classroom environment that is collaborative and where students are really able to help one another, learn from one another, teach one another. We didn't say the word peer-to-peer learning, but in everything that we were talking about, that's what we were talking about, was really allowing peer-to-peer learning to thrive. Rethinking what participation means and what it looks like. That not just the loudest voice in the classroom dominating the conversation, but how do we empower the students who might be quieter, who might be introverted, all different things, who might even need more time to process, to share. And then how do we provide students the resources they need so that they can own the learning? So we talked about that a bit in our flipped classroom conversation, but also just the technology as a way for students to be able to consume information at a pace, at a rate that is best for them, that's optimal for them. Very clear through video, but there's other ways to do it. It doesn't have to be through video, where students can adjust playback speed, they can pause, they can rewind, all these things. And then again, coach them through that process of really taking ownership for their learning, because it's a very hard piece. It's not easy for anybody. It's not easy to take a step back as a teacher to really allow students to own the learning. It's not easy for students, but I think it's one of the most powerful things we can do as a teacher to prepare them.
Awesome. Thank you, Stacey. This has been a really enjoyable and inspiring conversation for me. I know it will be the same for our listeners. As you're well aware, this chat will be made available to our Kognity lead educators via our hub for them on the community. So as and when any questions appear in the chat that accompanies this podcast, I will fire over any questions that come to you, and hopefully we can get some answers to help the lead educators on their way with integrating technology at their school. So Stacey, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a blast.
Thank you so much for having me for this conversation. And I look forward to hearing what people ask and what they share.
Awesome. Thank you. And talk to you again soon. Bye for now.
Bye.